It is a history of many. This is not a legend. It is a slow unfolding of how everyday life in small villages and mountain towns of old Romania turned quiet women into figures of fear. We begin with an explanation of how these women were seen. In rural areas of what is now Romania, especially during the medieval and early modern periods, communities were small, and social life was built around tradition, routine, and conformity. Most villages consisted of close-knit families with social roles passed down from generation to generation. Within these villages, a woman was expected to fulfill familiar roles: daughter, wife, mother, helper, churchgoer, field worker. Any behavior outside of this pattern could raise suspicion. A woman who lived alone was unusual. Most women lived with family, either parents, husbands, children, or siblings. A woman who had no husband, no children, and no extended family could be noticed for her isolation. If she had her own house, it was often on the edge of the village, simply because space was limited. But a house on the edge quickly became a symbol. It meant distance. It suggested she didn't want to be part of the group. That idea, even if untrue, made people uncomfortable. The daily activities of these women were not magical, they were practical. Many gathered herbs for medicine, made soap, cooked with wild plants, or prepared their own remedies. These practices were based on inherited knowledge passed from mothers and grandmothers. But over time, this kind of knowledge came to seem strange, especially if it was not explained clearly to others. If a woman knew how to treat a fever or stop a wound from bleeding, and others didn't know how she learned it, they might say she had unnatural skills. It wasn't only the knowledge that made her different. It was the way she lived. A woman who spent time alone in the forest was watched carefully. The forest, in Romanian folklore, was a place of both fear and power. It was seen as the home of spirits, wolves, wild women, and untamed forces. A woman who entered the forest often, especially alone, was seen as someone who knew how to speak to the wild. If she returned with unusual plants or with animal bones for tools, this behavior became part of her reputation. Physical appearance could also contribute. If a woman wore darker clothes or didn't keep herself as clean as others, or if her hair was always covered, people remembered it. If she had a limp or poor eyesight or an unusual voice, those traits became part of the story. Anything that made her less like the average village woman added to her profile. People in isolated communities noticed everything: how a person walked, how they spoke, when they left the house, what they carried in their hands. Speech mattered as well. A woman who talked to herself while working might be labeled as odd. A woman who muttered prayers under her breath, or who whispered blessings in the old dialects, might be remembered for it. Sometimes these were simply habits picked up from childhood. but to outsiders, they sounded like incantations. Many of these women still used Old Slavic or pre-Christian words, especially when dealing with illness or bad dreams. These old words, though harmless, seemed foreign and were often misunderstood. Daily routines were another source of scrutiny. For example, a woman who did not attend the local church every Sunday might be seen as suspicious. Religion was a central part of village life, especially Orthodox and later Catholic customs. An absence from church was noticed. If a woman arrived too early or too late, or if she left during a prayer, this could be mentioned. If she crossed herself in a different way or did not kneel at the proper moment, these details became exaggerated in retellings. Even helpful behavior could lead to suspicion. If a child was ill and the woman offered tea made from wild herbs, and the child recovered too quickly, some people might say her help was unnatural. On the other hand, if the child did not recover, others might say she had cursed the child. This put her in a no-win situation. If her remedy worked, it was suspicious. If it failed, it was dangerous. In either case, her knowledge made people uncomfortable. Dreams were another part of the culture that shaped belief. In many Romanian villages, dreams were not considered random. People believed they contained messages, warnings, blessings, or omens. If someone dreamed of fire and then a real fire occurred, that dream would be remembered. If they had dreamed of a woman, especially one already seen as strange, the connection would be made. A dream could be the start of a gossip, and gossip in small communities often grew into certainty. The cycle of suspicion usually began with minor events: a missing object, a spoiled meal, a bad harvest, a sudden illness in the family. People looked for causes beyond the natural. And if there was already a woman in the village who was seen as different, the blame found its way to her. People did not always say it aloud. They might only whisper it during a meal. They might only glance toward her house when passing. But over time, this silent suspicion grew heavier. It is important to understand that many people truly believed in magic and supernatural power. They believed in the evil eye, in curses, in spirits that walked at night. They believed that not everyone could be trusted, and that some women, especially those who lived on the edge of things, were too close to these forces. What made a woman suspicious was not one single action. It was a pattern, a set of small behaviors repeated over time. Alone, they meant nothing. But together, in the minds of those who watched her, they formed a picture of someone different, someone who could be called a witch. In many rural parts of old Romania, medicine was not what we know today. There were no doctors in most villages. There were no pharmacies, no clinics, no trained nurses. The people relied on what they could grow, gather, or trade. Illnesses were treated at home. Wounds were cared for by hands that had learned through observation. And many women became the keepers of this knowledge. A woman who knew herbs was not unusual. Many did. Most households kept dried leaves for tea, garlic for infections, and honey for wounds. These were common, but some women knew more. They knew which plant to use when the cough was dry and when the cough was wet. They knew how to lower fever with bark and how to stop bleeding with moss. They knew the times of year when plants were strongest and how the moon affected the roots. They kept seeds from special plants, hung bunches of leaves upside down to dry, and stored them carefully in jars or cloth pouches. This deeper knowledge was respected but also feared. When a woman could cure something others could not, people wondered why. When she could name plants others didn't recognize, they asked how. She might say she learned from her mother or grandmother, but that wasn't always enough. The explanations felt too old, too quiet, too mysterious. The teas were dark, the pastes sticky, the powders strange. They worked, but not in ways people understood. The effect might come slowly, or it might come suddenly. A headache gone within an hour. A swelling that faded overnight. This caused people to ask if the plants alone were responsible or if something else had been added. It was common for healing women to be called upon when childbirth went wrong. If the baby did not come, if the pain was too strong, or if the bleeding wouldn't stop, someone would run to her door. She would arrive with cloth, warm water, and bitter herbs. She would massage the belly, press certain points, speak gently, and prepare strong tea. If the mother lived, the healer was thanked. But if the mother died, or if the baby was stillborn, the healer became a suspect. People wanted someone to blame. They did not understand illness as we do today. Many believed sickness came from imbalance between God and sin. Between God and sin, between the natural and the unnatural. A woman who could control these things, even slightly, seemed too close to power. And power in the hands of a woman outside the church or family was considered dangerous. Some women also used herbs for things that were not physical. They brewed teas to ease grief. They burned leaves to calm nightmares. They made charm pouches to hang above a baby's cradle or sew into the lining of clothing. These were protective, meant to keep away spirits, jealousy, and the evil eye. Most people believed in these things. They wore red string to protect children. They kept scissors under the pillow to ward off nightmares. But if a woman made too many of these charms, or if hers were known to be especially strong, people questioned her intentions. Certain herbs were especially suspicious. Mandrake, henbane, belladonna. These were strong plants, sometimes poisonous, sometimes useful. They were hard to find and harder to prepare safely. A woman who knew how to use them correctly was seen as someone with dangerous knowledge. Even if she used them to help, their reputation followed her. The same plant that helped a woman sleep could also make her sick. The same root that stopped pain could stop a heartbeat. This fine line made people nervous. Women who sold herbal mixtures at the market often faced quiet judgment. They sat with their baskets bundles of dried flowers, small vials of oil, folded leaves tied with thread. They did not shout to sell. They waited. Some villagers came openly. Others waited until the crowd had passed. They did not want to be seen asking for help. But when help was received and the remedy worked, they remembered who gave it. When something later went wrong, a bad harvest, a sudden death, an unexplained fire, they remembered again. She had helped too easily, they thought. Her herbs had tasted too strong. Her touch had felt too cold. Maybe she had not helped at all. Maybe she had caused the problem first. This suspicion was not based on proof. It was built on fear. The more a woman knew, the more people feared she knew too much. Her silence was not seen as humility. It was seen as secrecy. Her jars and powders were not seen as medicine. They were seen as ingredients for spells. In some regions, herbs were also tied to old rituals, things remembered from before Christianity became dominant. There were plants used in fertility rites, in midsummer dances, in songs sung by girls at the edge of the forest. A woman who remembered these things or still used them was said to be holding on to the old ways. And holding on to the old ways was another path to being called a witch. Some of these healing women were also midwives. They knew the signs of labor, the turning of the baby, the meaning of certain pains. They had helped dozens of births, sometimes more than the village priest had baptized. But if a baby came out quiet or sickly, the midwife was questioned. If a mother could not conceive and had once taken a tea from the same woman, that too was remembered. Women who could help with problems of the womb, pregnancy, miscarriage, infertility were especially at risk. These were private matters, deeply emotional and often misunderstood. A tea that ended a pregnancy was never spoken of directly, but it was known. A woman who provided such tea was both needed and feared. If someone later regretted it, or became ill, or was unable to conceive again, the blame returned to the one who had made the mixture. Knowledge that helped one person could easily be turned into gossip by another. And gossip was the beginning of accusation. A woman did not need to call herself a healer to be seen as one. She only needed to help once, in a way others didn't understand. From that point on, everything she touched, said, or did was seen through a different lens. Religion shaped almost every part of daily life in old Romanian villages. Most people were Orthodox Christian, especially in the regions of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania. Though Catholicism had influence in certain areas, especially in villages with Hungarian or Saxon populations, the church was not just a place of worship. It was a source of rules, identity, safety, and rhythm. From birth to death, almost every part of a person's life was marked by religious ceremonies. Babies were baptized within weeks of birth. Weddings were held in front of the altar. The dead were buried with crosses placed in their hands, and crosses made of palm branches from Easter services. People fasted according to the church calendar, refrained from working on holy days, and observed saints' days with strict attention. In many homes, the priest's words carried more weight than the law. A woman's place in this structure was clearly defined. She was expected to attend church, follow the rituals, confess, fast, and take communion. She was also expected to marry, bear children, and serve her family. A woman who lived quietly within these expectations was accepted. A woman who did not was noticed. Some women, either by choice or circumstance, lived outside this religious routine. Perhaps they had lost faith after the death of a child. Perhaps they did not feel welcome inside the church. Perhaps they followed older traditions from their mothers, passed down before Christian influence reached their region. These women often kept to themselves. They did not always attend Mass. They might light candles at home instead of in the church. They might wear small charms instead of crosses. They might avoid confession altogether. To their neighbors, this was strange. In a society where public behavior was watched carefully, even quiet acts of difference became meaningful. If a woman stayed home on Easter Sunday, people asked why. If she did not fast during Lent, people noticed. If she was not seen making the sign of the cross when passing the cemetery, someone would eventually mention it. Sometimes the reasons were practical. A woman might be sick, or too poor to afford church clothes, or unable to leave the house due to age. But over time, these reasons were forgotten, and only the difference remained. A pattern formed. A reputation developed. Even a woman who followed most customs, but with too little emotion or enthusiasm, might be seen as distant from faith. There were also women who observed both Christian and older folk traditions. They might go to church and also hang garlic above the door. They might light candles for saints and also whisper spells to protect against envy. These blends of practice were common, but if one woman was already seen as strange, her participation in older rituals became a point of concern. Church leaders sometimes contributed to this suspicion. Priests were respected, but they also carried the authority to warn others. If a priest thought a woman was too proud, too quiet, too resistant, he might speak of her in sermons, not by name, but with enough detail that the message was clear. A warning against women who rely on herbs, not holy water, or those who live outside marriage and speak of strange dreams could turn the community's attention toward someone specific without ever saying her name. Confession was another area where judgment took shape. Women were expected to confess regularly. If a woman refused to speak openly with the priest or avoided him entirely, her silence was interpreted as guilt. It did not matter if her reasons were personal. What mattered was that she did not follow the expected path. Fasting and holy days were taken seriously. On certain days, Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, and many saint feast days, people refrained from meat, dairy, or oil. If a woman was seen cooking meat during these times, or eating butter in public, others would whisper. They might say she rejected the sacred calendar. They might say her soul was hardened. And if other misfortunes occurred nearby, they would remember what she had eaten. Participation in religious life also included behavior at funerals, weddings, and baptisms. If a woman wept too loudly or not at all, if she stood too far from the others, if she did not kiss the cross in the proper way, things were noticed. People talked about them on the walk home, by the fire, and over meals. What began as a comment became concern. What became concern eventually turned into fear. Old folk beliefs often overlapped with religious customs, but the church discouraged many of these practices. Fortune-telling, dream interpretation, and protective charms were seen as superstitions, even if they had been used for generations. A woman who continued these practices, especially openly, was seen as challenging church authority. Even if she believed in God, she was viewed as someone who kept one foot in the old world. The church also discouraged women from gathering in small groups without religious purpose. If a woman often hosted others in her home without reason, it raised questions. What were they doing? What were they talking about? This fear of hidden gatherings reflected older worries about rebellion or ritual. In a village where community life was controlled and watched, too much privacy felt threatening. A woman who did not marry was also more at risk. Marriage, in the eyes of the church, was not just a social duty, it was spiritual protection. A husband was meant to keep a woman safe, both physically and morally. A woman alone was seen as vulnerable to temptation, or worse, capable of tempting others. Her lack of a husband was treated not as chance, but as a choice, and a dangerous one. Religious paintings and church stories often showed witches as tools of the devil, women who tempted men and caused misfortune. These images shaped how people saw women who lived outside the norm. Even if no one said the word aloud, the comparisons were clear. A woman who stood alone, too often, who knew too much, who prayed differently or not at all. She was placed slowly into that shadow. This did not happen in one day. It happened over months, sometimes years. But once it began, it was hard to stop. The church had its rules. The people had their stories. And a woman who did not fit into both stood apart. In Romanian villages of the past, daily life followed a strong routine. Every member of the household had a role, and each day was shaped by labor. Women in particular were expected to wake early, often before sunrise, and begin the tasks that kept the household alive. These tasks included gathering water from the well, sweeping the yard, feeding animals, grinding flour, making bread, tending to the fire, spinning wool, and caring for children. Work was steady, and it was visible. Everyone could see who worked, how they worked, and when they rested. Because the village was small, every action became known. People observed each other without trying. If a woman did her chores in a different way or at a different time, which noticed. For example, if she swept her yard before dawn, some might ask why. If she stayed outside late in the evening collecting herbs, others might watch from their windows. Even helpful tasks done at the wrong hour or in an unfamiliar manner could raise suspicion. Most women walked in pairs or small groups. They went to the well together, visited neighbors together, and walked to the market together. This was for safety, for companionship, and for tradition. A woman who walked alone, especially at unusual times, was considered different. If she walked too quietly, people asked what she was listening to. If she stared at the sky or stopped often to look at plants or stones, they asked what she was looking for. Carrying strange objects also drew attention. Most women carried predictable tools, baskets, buckets, spinning materials. But if a woman was seen carrying bones, feathers, or jars filled with unclear substances, people began to talk. She might say, the bones were for soup, or the feathers for stuffing, or the jars for oil. Still, people remembered the image, and they retold it to others. With each retelling, the story changed slightly, till what was once a harmless object became part of something more. Some women liked to gather materials from the forest. They looked for herbs, bark, mushrooms, or stones. Many plants were useful: mint, chamomile, nettle, elderflower. These were known, but others were less familiar. If a woman picked leaves no one else used, or collected them in silence, or stored them in hidden places, this behavior was recorded in people's minds. The forest itself had symbolic meaning. It was wild, mysterious, and tied to old stories. Women who moved comfortably through it were seen as too comfortable with the unknown. In the home, women spent much time making textiles, Spinning, weaving, and embroidery were not just crafts, they were necessities. Clothes, sheets, and blankets were all made by hand. Patterns were often passed down from family to family. Certain symbols had meaning. Some were decorative, some were protective. A woman who used unusual patterns or who embroidered objects others didn't recognize might be asked where she learned them. If her answer was vague or quiet, people assumed she knew something she wasn't saying. Even the way she arranged her home could matter. Most houses had icons on the wall, a cross near the bed, and clearly marked areas for food, sleep, and storage. If a woman placed unfamiliar items near her door like stones, twigs, or dried herbs, people began to wonder if she was protecting herself or casting something out. If smoke came from her chimney too early or too late in the day, some might say she was burning things in secret. Domestic animals were part of daily life. Almost every household had chickens, goats, or a pig. But cats were treated differently. A woman who kept several cats, especially if they followed her closely, was sometimes seen as suspicious. Cats were associated with independence and with nighttime. In folk belief, they were also connected to unseen forces. If a cat stared at someone for too long or meowed at the wrong time, some believed it was reacting to something invisible. If that cat belonged to a woman already considered strange, the meaning deepened. Children also noticed things. They repeated what they saw. If a woman walked through the village and children ran away, others began to question why. If a child cried after seeing her or dreamed about her, that too became part of her reputation. It didn't matter that these reactions were common or random. What mattered was that people talked about them. In a place where reputation was shaped by repetition, even the smallest detail grew heavy over time. There were also sounds that caused discomfort. Some women sang while they worked. This was common. But if the melody was unfamiliar or sung at an odd time, like at night or in the rain, people remembered it. Some melodies were associated with old rituals or mourning. If a woman sang these often, others believed she was invoking something from the past. Resting at strange times also caused talk. Most women rested briefly after lunch during the hottest part of the day. If a woman rested during morning chores or did not rise until late, neighbors began to question her discipline. If she stayed awake long after dark or lit her house with more candles than usual, people said she was doing things not meant to be seen. Candlelight had meaning. It was used during prayer, death, and ritual. Too much candlelight suggested something beyond simple living. Visitors, too, shaped perception. If a woman received visitors from other villages, or if she spoke to travelers in private, others asked what they were doing. If no one else in the village recognized the guests, their presence became suspicious. If she was never seen with anyone at all, her solitude became its own problem. The pace of her movement mattered. If she walked too fast, she was nervous. If she walked too slow, she was watching. If she changed direction without cause, someone said she must be hiding something. Even the way she looked at others became a subject of talk. A direct stare was bold. Averted eyes were secretive. A smile at the wrong moment was unnatural. None of these actions, taken alone, made her a witch. But together, over time, they created a picture. A woman whose days were too quiet. A woman whose habits were not quite right. A woman who, without doing anything wrong, was always doing something strange. In old Romanian villages, where science had not yet reached and books were rare, people explained the world through stories and belief. Life was full of unpredictability. Storms ruined crops. Animals fell ill. Children died young, and diseases spread without warning. Without understanding the causes, people turned to what they knew. Traditions, superstitions, and ancient explanations passed down through generations. These beliefs were not considered strange. They were common knowledge. People accepted them the way they accepted the shape of the mountains or the turning of the seasons. Everyone knew, for example, that envy could hurt you. If someone looked at your child with jealousy, it could cause the child to fall sick. This was called the evil eye. To protect against it, people tied red string around the wrist, hung garlic near the bed, or placed scissors under pillows. A woman who did not use these protections, or who used different ones, was watched. If she used feathers instead of thread, bones instead of garlic, stones instead of prayer, people grew uncomfortable. They believed she was working with forces outside the accepted balance. Even if her intent was harmless, the unfamiliar methods marked her as different. Sickness had many names and even more causes. Fevers were believed to come from a bad wind. Seizures were seen as possession. Wasting illness could be the result of a curse. A child who cried through the night might be under the influence of a spirit. Or worse, someone might have stepped over its clothing and cursed it by accident. In such a world, anything unusual had meaning. If a dog barked at night without reason, it was a sign. If milk soured too fast, or firewood cracked in a strange way, people read warnings into it. If a rooster crowed at the wrong time of day, it was not just noise, it was a message. These interpretations helped people make sense of things they could not control. Women who were associated with these events, even loosely, were remembered. If a woman passed by shortly before an accident, her timing became suspicious. If she offered help, and the help worked too well or not, at all that too became part of the story. No one needed proof. It was enough to recall that she had been nearby. Whether also had spiritual importance. Storms were said to be sent by God, but they could also be brought on by witches. Hail that destroyed the crops was not always seen as natural. People believed some women could call storms or drive them away. If a woman walked out during a thunderstorm without fear, others watched her carefully. If her garden remained untouched while others' crops were ruined, her luck became a curse in others' eyes. There were rituals used to protect the land crosses made in the dirt, ash spread on the fields, holy water sprinkled over livestock. These were normal. But if a woman used ashes from her own hearth or herbs no one else recognized, people questioned what she was trying to do. Even if her efforts worked, the method was enough to make people whisper. Curses were another fear. Many villagers believed that words, gestures, or objects could be used to bring harm. If a woman muttered to herself after an argument, it could be seen as a curse. If she looked at someone and the person later grew ill, it could be linked. If she was heard singing at night and something bad happened the next day, the connection was made. Curses did not require ceremony. They could be as simple as a glance. A woman who glared instead of speaking was seen as dangerous. If she touched something and it broke later, people remembered. A cracked mirror, a spilled jug, or a torn piece of cloth could all be seen as the results of her presence. Old folk belief also warned against stepping over certain things. Broom, a child's shoe, a spindle of thread. These were seen as vulnerable to magical interference. If a woman was seen placing or moving these items in unusual ways, or if her house contained bundles of knotted string or wax figures, others assumed she was practicing something secret. Dreams were taken seriously. People shared their dreams each morning, looking for signs. If someone dreamed of a snake, they expected betrayal. If they dreamed of fire, they prepared for loss. If a woman appeared in someone's dream and something bad happened soon after, that dream was not forgotten. Her image in a dream, even once, made her name a part of future discussions. The night was a time of particular fear. Spirits were believed to travel after dark. Some said souls of the dead wandered at night, especially if they had died suddenly or without proper burial. People lit candles in the windows or placed water on the table for the spirits. A woman who walked outside late at night, even if just to fetch water, might be seen as meeting something or someone from beyond. Silence, too, was feared. A woman who did not explain herself, who did not tell her dreams, who did not ask for help or offer it, became a blank space into which fears were projected. People did not like what they could not understand, and in old Romanian villages, understanding was based on patterns, on doing things the same way, at the same time, for the same reasons. A woman who broke these patterns became a question, and in a fearful society, questions were dangerous. The idea of the witch was not a specific figure with a pointed hat or a broomstick. It was a name given to women who were feared, and fear in these communities was built slowly from a look, a touch, a word, or a dream. Over time, that fear shaped behavior. People began to avoid her. Children stopped speaking her name. Doors stayed closed when she walked by. She might not have done anything wrong, but she had become the explanation for everything that had no explanation. In old Romanian communities, birth was a sacred and fragile moment. It was surrounded by silence, fear, and tradition. Life and death often stood very close together. Medical care did not exist in the way we understand it today. Women gave birth at home in their own beds, surrounded by female relatives or neighbors. There was no doctor, no nursery hands that had done it before. At the center of this moment was the midwife. She was not just a helper. She was a guide through something invisible. Most villages had at least one woman known for helping with births. She was usually older, with years of experience. Her knowledge was passed down, not written. She knew how to check the position of the baby, how to ease pain, how to stop bleeding. She knew when to be quiet and when to act. She carried cloths, herbs, warm water, and calmness. This role came with respect, but also fear. The midwife was believed to hold power. She was there at the very edge of life. She saw the baby before anyone else. She held the mother's body during its most vulnerable moment. She decided what to do when something went wrong. In many ways, she became responsible for outcomes she could not always control. If the birth went well, she was praised. But if the baby died or the mother suffered, blame followed. People asked if the midwife had made a mistake, if she had waited too long, if she had touched something she shouldn't have, if she had used the wrong herbs or no herbs at all. Some even asked whether she had meant for the child not to live. In Romanian folk tradition, birth was tied to both divine and spiritual forces. People believed in unseen influences. Bad spirits were said to gather around women in labor. Doors were kept closed. Sharp tools were hidden. Garlic was placed under the bed. Prayers were whispered. Not all of these were Christian. Some came from much older traditions, but they were followed closely because the danger felt real. The midwife was expected to know these protections. She might say a prayer before touching the mother. She might draw symbols in ash around the bed. She might hang herbs on the wall or wash her hands in water left under the moon. These were not considered strange because they were shared practices. But if she did something unfamiliar, she whispered in a different language or sang a tune no one recognized, people grew uneasy. She was also expected to know when a birth was unnatural. For example, if a baby was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck, or if the child did not cry right away, it was believed that something had interfered. Perhaps a spirit had entered the house. Perhaps a curse had been placed on the family. And since the midwife had been there, perhaps she had let it happen. Some women became midwives only for a short time. After 1 or 2 difficult births, they were avoided. If a baby was born with a mark, or with extra fingers or toes, the midwife was remembered. People said she had seen too much, that her hands had touched something they shouldn't have, that she had called something into the room instead of keeping it out. There were also beliefs around women who could prevent birth. These women were not midwives, but they knew herbs that could stop a pregnancy. Such knowledge was secret and only shared in whispers. If a woman became pregnant outside of marriage, she might seek help in secret. If she later married and could not have children, people remembered what she had done. If she miscarried often, they asked who she had spoken to in her youth. A woman who provided this help was feared even more than the midwife. She had knowledge that touched on shame, on blood, on choice. She was rarely thanked in public. But if anything went wrong, if another woman miscarried, or if a newborn died, her name was spoken again. Not as a healer, but as a cause. Birth and fertility were not just private matters. They were tied to a woman's value. A wife was expected to have children. If she could not, she was often blamed. If she had many children, she was admired. If a woman remained unmarried or had no children by choice, her body was seen as unnatural. People wondered what she did with her time, with her knowledge, with her silence. In this way, women who were too close to the mysteries of life became targets. The line between healer and witch was very thin. Helping others could become the reason for exclusion. Knowing too much about the body was seen as stepping into territory meant for God. Some women tried to protect themselves. They only helped people they trusted. They asked for witnesses during births. They prayed aloud before and after each delivery. They kept no herbs in the open and no charms under their bed. But even this was not always enough. If a woman helped too many births or too few, questions began to rise. If she stayed with a laboring mother too long or left too quickly, people noticed. If she looked tired, they said she had given part of her strength to the child. If she looked well, they said she had taken strength from the mother. There were stories in some regions of midwives who touched the child before it took its first breath and claimed it. These were not common beliefs, but they were whispered during quiet moments. A mother might ask why her baby cried every night, or why it did not grow. And someone might answer, it was touched too soon, or too late, or with the wrong hand. This fear made the midwife's life very narrow. She had to walk carefully, speak simply, hide her knowledge behind ordinary words, smile even when she was tired, agree even when she knew more than others. Because the same hands that brought life into the world could also be accused of bringing death. In these communities, birth was holy, but it was also frightening, and the women who stood closest to it stood closest to danger. In old Romanian villages, age was respected, but it was also feared. To live into old age, especially for a woman, was both a blessing and a burden. Life expectancy was low. Many women died young, in childbirth or from illness. If a woman lived past 60, 70, or more, people called her strong. But they also called her something else strange. Most elderly women lived with family sons, daughters, or grandchildren, but some lived alone. These were the widows, the childless, or those whose relatives had died or moved away. A woman who outlived her entire family was not always seen as lucky. She was often seen as unnatural. People asked, how had she survived when others had not? What had she done to live so long? Her home was usually small, a single room, sometimes with a small yard. The roof might sag, the door might creak. The window shutters might stay closed during the day. She burned little wood in winter, cooked simple meals, and kept her belongings in old wooden boxes. Her days were quiet. Her movements were slow. She hummed old songs that no one else remembered. To the young, she was a figure of mystery. Children were warned not to bother her. Teenagers dared each other to walk past her house at night. Adults said little but watched her carefully. If she came to the market, people moved aside. If she joined a funeral, some turned their eyes. She was not shunned outright, but she was surrounded by silence. Loneliness made her more visible. If she had no one to speak for her, no one to defend her, no one to vouch for her kindness, she was vulnerable. People began to fill in the gaps of her life with imagination. They said she must have known spells. She must have made pacts. She must have traded something to live so long. Old age changed the body. Her hands might tremble. Her back might bend. Her voice might crack. Her eyes might seem to stare through people rather than at them. If she laughed at the wrong time, people said she was mad. If she cried for no reason, they said she saw spirits. If she said she had dreamed of something before it happened, they said she was speaking in signs. Many of these women knew how to use herbs. They treated their own pain. They had seen children born, crops fail, animals die, and wars pass. Their lives were full of experience, but experience was not always welcome. A young woman who asked for advice might be praised. An old woman who offered it without being asked might be seen as interfering. Some of these women talked to animals. They called two birds in the yard. fed stray cats, or kept chickens as company. If a dog followed them home, people said it had been enchanted. If a bird landed on their fence, they said it was a messenger. Even if the animals came for food, the stories turned them into signs. Old women often became the keepers of memory. They remembered storms, fires, and deaths from decades past. But memory, especially when spoken aloud, could become unsettling. If she mentioned a child who died before it grew teeth, or a marriage that ended too soon, people wondered why she still remembered. They said she must be holding onto something dark. Sometimes she was blamed for things no one could explain. A spoiled batch of cheese, a broken wheel, a cow that stopped giving milk. If she had passed by that morning, or looked toward the barn, or mentioned the animal's name, the connection was made. If she had said, "Be careful," the day before, it was said to be a curse. There were old sayings that fueled the fear. She has one foot in this world and one in the next. She has buried too many to still be among the living. These were said with nervous laughter, but they were believed, and they were repeated. Widows were especially vulnerable. A woman without a husband had no male voice to defend her. Her presence at weddings or births was watched. If she wore black long after the proper mourning period, people asked if she was clinging to death. If she stopped wearing black too soon, they said she had moved on too quickly. Childless women were also at risk. In a world where children were seen as proof of God's blessing, a woman with no children was considered incomplete. If she never married, or if all her children had died, people wondered if her womb had been closed by choice, by something else. And if she had helped raise other people's children, her influence was seen as suspect. Even the things she owned could cause concern. Old books inherited from her father or husband, dried plants hanging from her ceiling, a small carved figure on her shelf, a painting with eyes that seemed to follow, a comb made from bone, a candle that never seemed to melt. These were ordinary objects, but in the mind of a suspicious neighbor, they became pieces of a story. A story of a woman who lived too long, who knew too much, who had outlived her usefulness. In times of hardship, when food was scarce, or crops failed, or illness spread, these women were often the first to be accused. Not in public, not in court, but in whispers, in glances, in the space left empty at a gathering. No one said which, but everyone acted as if she might be. Some women noticed. They stayed indoors. They stopped speaking. They lit candles for protection. Others ignored the talk. They kept walking through the village, head high, eyes steady. But even then, they knew. They had seen it before. They had watched others age into silence, and now it was their turn. In old Romanian life, a long life was a rare thing, but it was also a lonely thing, and loneliness, when mixed with fear, made people see shadows where there were none. In small Romanian villages, people lived close together. Homes were near each other, paths were narrow, fields were shared, water came from the same well. There was no real privacy. Every movement could be seen. Every word could be overheard. Because of this closeness, small disagreements carried weight. A single quarrel could last for years. Women often worked side by side. They washed clothes by the river. They spun wool in each other's yards. They baked bread in outdoor ovens. During these moments, words passed as leisurely jokes, advice, but also criticism. A woman who worked too slowly was seen as lazy. One who worked too quickly was said to show off. One who kept to herself was seen as proud. These feelings built slowly, like dust on old wood, until one day they formed a crack. Jealousy was common. Some women had larger dowries. Others had more children. Some had strong husbands, healthy livestock, or full gardens. A single good harvest, a plump baby, a clean white blouse, these things could spark envy. It was not always admitted, but it lived quietly in glances and sighs. If a woman was envied, others waited for her luck to turn. And when it did, when her cow died or her child fell ill, it was taken as balance. But if her luck continued too long, suspicion began to grow. They said she must have done something to stay fortunate. Maybe she had whispered something to the wind. Maybe she had buried something under the threshold. Maybe she had taken from others without them knowing. Quarrels often began with something small. A disagreement over a fence. A hen that wandered into the wrong yard. A missing spool of thread. Harsh words were exchanged. One woman shouted. The other cursed under her breath. Both went home angry. But while men might fight openly and then forget, women's quarrels could stretch into silence, cold stares, and quiet revenge. Sometimes the revenge was only imagined. A woman who had argued with her neighbor was blamed when the neighbor's child became sick. If a woman refused to lend something, a needle, a pinch of salt, a measure of flour, she was remembered later when misfortune came. People said she had cursed the food, soured the milk, broken the friendship with more than just words. There were stories of women who threw salt behind enemies, who spat 3 times after turning their backs, who whispered as they stirred their soup. These were old signs, gestures said to carry hidden meaning. Most women used them without thought, but when a woman already seemed different, every small action was read like a warning. In times of conflict, objects took on power. If a clay pot cracked After an argument, people said it had been cursed. If a mirror broke or a candle refused to stay lit, it was tied to that disagreement. If a woman found something strange on her doorstep, dead bird, a bundle of thread, a piece of burned cloths, she looked for enemies. Women sometimes used charms for protection. They tied small herbs in their aprons. They kept salt in their pockets. They drew symbols in the dust with their fingers. These actions were not always seen as dangerous, but if the woman using them had been part of a recent fight, people said she was preparing more than defense. Accusation was not always loud. It came in careful words. "She's not quite right," or "I don't trust her hands." Sometimes it was just a question. "Have you noticed her lately?" But once those words were spoken, the listener remembered them. And when something bad happened again, the words seemed to explain it. Children sometimes repeated things they heard at home. They said one woman had strange eyes, that she stared too long. A child might say they had bad dreams after seeing her, or that the bread she gave them tasted bitter. These stories were shared without malice, but once told, they could not be taken back. Women who quarreled often were especially vulnerable. If she had fought with her neighbor, with her cousin, with the midwife, or with the priest's wife, people said she held too much anger. They believed anger, when held too long, turned into power, that she could speak pain into someone else's life just by wishing it. Sometimes, when a child grew sick, the mother would search for a reason. She would recall every person who had looked at the child, every visitor, every argument she had that month. If she remembered one woman who had walked away in silence, that woman became a suspect. It did not matter that the sickness came from a fever or a wound or hunger. It mattered who had been nearby. Women who were blamed often did not respond. Some knew it would pass. Others had seen it happen before. They did not cry or defend themselves. They went on with their days, but their silence was taken as proof. People said, "She doesn't deny it," or "Look how calm she is." Calm in the face of pain was not seen as peace, was seen as coldness. Sometimes people said they had seen signs: a dog barking at a door, a fire that would not start, bread that would not rise, a shadow that passed across the floor. These were signs that someone nearby had done something wrong. And if the same woman's name was already in their minds, the sign pointed to her. Disputes over land or animals could also lead to suspicion. If a woman claimed part of a field, or if she said a goat belonged to her and not her neighbor, and then something bad happened to that neighbor's animals, the cause was clear in people's minds. Not fact, but belief. In Romanian folk thought, misfortune did not come without a cause. And when no clear cause could be found, people looked for the person who had once spoken sharply, who had looked in a certain way, who had not come to the funeral, who had not helped at harvest, who had once argued in public. That was often enough. In the quiet spaces between fields and wells, between spinning wheels and market stalls, suspicion grew like weeds, fed not by proof, but by memory and feeling. And once it took root, it was very hard to pull out. The night in old Romanian villages was not like the day. It was not simply a time of rest. It was a time of mystery, of caution, of stories. People feared the dark in a way that was quiet but strong. Fires were dimmed early. Doors were bolted. Lamps were placed near icons. Children were told not to speak after the sun had gone down. Night was the hour of spirits, of shadows, and of dreams. It was believed that invisible things moved more freely after dark, that the veil between the living and the dead became thin, that prayers spoken after midnight had different weight, that curses, if uttered softly in the dark, would take root more deeply. Dreams were taken seriously. They were not considered private imagination, but windows into another realm. A dream could be a message, a warning, or even an attack. People remembered their dreams and shared them in the morning, speaking low and slow over bread and boiled milk. If someone dreamed of falling, it was said they would lose something. If they dreamed of a snake, it meant betrayal. If they dreamed of fire, it meant news good or bad. If a woman appeared in someone's dream more than once, people began to talk. They said she had entered the dream, not by accident, but with intent. Especially if the dream caused fear, discomfort, or sickness. It did not matter if she had done nothing in the dream, her presence alone was suspicious. If a child woke up crying and said he had seen a woman standing near the bed, the mother asked which woman. If he pointed to the one who lived alone, who spoke little, whose eyes were pale, the mother remembered. Women who talked about their dreams too freely were also seen as unusual. Most people shared dreams only with family. A woman who described her dreams in public, or said she had seen things before they happened, made others uneasy. People wondered how she could know, whether her dreams were just dreams or something more. Night wanderings were feared. A woman seen walking after dark, even slowly, even close to home, caused whispers. Why was she out? What had she seen? Whom had she met? Even practical reasons, checking the animals, fetching wood, were forgotten in the face of imagination. If her path crossed a sleeping dog and it howled, people remembered the sound. If a candle flickered in her window long after midnight, people wondered what she was doing. Some people claimed to see things. A woman walking without leaving footprints. A shadow moving without a body. A light that passed across the fields and vanished. These stories were told quietly, often by those who did not want to believe them but could not forget them. There were tales of women who rode the wind or traveled in their sleep. These were not always believed literally, but they were spoken with care. Some said certain women's spirits left their bodies at night to visit others, that they returned by dawn, leaving no trace but a cold spot in the room. If someone woke up tired or sick or sore, they asked who had visited in the night. If a woman had looked at them strangely the day before, her name came to mind. Snoring, murmuring, or talking in one's sleep was also watched. If a woman was heard speaking strange words while she slept, words that did not match any known prayer or language, people said she was speaking with spirits. If she laughed in her sleep, or cried, or sang, it was remembered. Women who did not sleep at all were also feared. If she was seen standing at the window through the night, if her house showed light when all others were dark, if the sound of sweeping, whispering, or stirring came from her home long after curfew, neighbors took note. Some said she was protecting herself. Others said she was preparing something. Even the dreams of others could influence her image. If 3 people dreamed of her in the same week, it was not seen as chance. People said she was moving through the village, that her spirit had become restless, that she was reaching out, whether she meant to or not. There were certain nights believed to carry more power. The night before certain saints' days, the first full moon of spring, the longest night of winter. On these nights, it was said that the border between the seen and unseen faded. Women who did not follow the usual customs, lighting candles, sprinkling salt, staying indoors, were noticed. If they were out during these hours, or seen near crossroads or wells, people said they were seeking something. The fear was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet and steady, like a stream under snow. People did not accuse directly. They crossed themselves when she passed. They walked on the other side of the road. They closed their shutters earlier than usual. Children were told not to speak her name at bedtime. If sickness came in the morning, a headache, a rash, a cow that refused to stand, people remembered the dreams. They remembered the figure in the dark, the voice outside the window, the shadow that passed without sound. They did not say which. They did not need to. Silence did the work. A woman who lived quietly but differently became the center of quiet stories, especially if she did not sleep like the others. If her dreams traveled, if her steps were heard after midnight, if her fire never quite went out. In these places, at these times, night did not forgive strangeness, and the woman who carried mystery into the hours of darkness often found it return to her in the form of fear. Life in old Romanian villages was guided by the seasons. Each time of year brought its own duties, its own weather, and its own rituals. People followed these rhythms, not only because they were necessary, but because they were believed to keep the world in balance. To break from this pattern, even slightly, drew notice. And a woman who moved differently through the seasons was often marked as strange. In spring, the earth was prepared. Seeds were planted, trees were trimmed, and rain was welcomed. It was a hopeful season, but also delicate. Crops could fail if frost returned. Illness spread easily in the changing air. To protect the new season, people performed small acts. They wore red and white threads, avoided whistling at night, and washed their faces with water from the first spring rain. A woman who ignored these customs or followed different ones was noticed. If she wore colors not tied to the season, people said she walked out of step. If she swept her yard on the wrong morning or dug her garden under a full moon, they wondered what she was calling to grow. The celebration of Easter was one of the most sacred. Eggs were dyed, lamb was cooked, and homes were scrubbed clean. Icons were washed, bells were rung. Women made new blouses, wore clean aprons, and braided their hair. It was a time of renewal. If a woman did not participate, she wore the same clothes, did not bake bread, or did not attend the church service. People whispered. They asked why her house smelled of old smoke and not sweet bread, why her yard was quiet when others were singing, why no candle burned in her window on Easter night. Midsummer was another powerful time. It was believed that herbs gathered on the night of Sanzin, a midsummer festival, carried extra strength. Girls wove flower crowns and floated them in streams. Some listened for whispers in the tall grass, hoping to hear the name of a future husband. A woman who picked herbs at night alone was not always admired. If she gathered plants others did not recognize, or if she did not share what she found, people said she was making something hidden. If she returned with wet skirts and a blank expression, they said she had been speaking with things no one else could see. In autumn, the harvest defined everything. Corn was gathered, wheat was ground, and fruits were preserved. It was a busy season, and every hand was needed. Neighbors worked together to finish before the weather turned cold. If a woman worked alone, it was unusual. If she did not join in with the others, if she did not laugh or sing or trade apples for salt, she became separate. Some said she had no one. Others said she wanted no one. And some said she had help no one could see. During this season, people also prepared charms for winter bottles of holy water, bundles of dried plants, protective icons. Windows were sealed with straw. Garlic was placed behind doors. fireplaces were cleaned carefully. If a woman did not prepare in these ways, she used no garlic, no straw, no icons. People asked what kept her safe. If she burned strange-smelling herbs or cleaned her chimney at night, they wondered what she was sending away. Winter was the longest test. Days were short. Cold was bitter. The ground froze. Food had to last. Families stayed inside, around the fire, telling stories and watching the flame. Silence crept into corners. Shadows stretched early. Christmas was the light in this season. Carols were sung. Pigs were slaughtered. Bread was shaped with crosses. Children dressed in white and walked from house to house. Doors opened. Voices rose. Candles flickered. If she did not offer bread to the carolers, or if her house remained dark while others glowed, people asked why. If her chimney gave no smoke, they said she did not eat. If it gave too much, they said she was boiling something secret. Winter also brought strange sounds. Wind through the trees, ice cracking on the roof, dogs barking at empty roads. It was easy to imagine spirits near. People placed crosses above the bed and sprinkled salt near the threshold. They avoided saying certain names after dark. A woman who muttered during these nights, who walked through the snow without footprints visible in the morning, became part of the stories. If she sang while others slept, or wore no shawl against the cold, her strength was not seen as resilience, but as unnatural. In every season, there were small rituals that marked the change. Stepping on dew in May, not sweeping on the Day of the Dead, hanging linen only after a certain hour, feeding the fire in a particular way. These were known customs, never written down, but remembered. A woman who broke them or created her own confused the balance. If she lit candles on odd days, or fasted without cause, or spoke to the sky instead of the cross, she caused discomfort. Even if her intentions were good, her difference made people uneasy. There were some who admired her. They said she had wisdom, that she followed older paths, that she knew things others had forgotten. But even admiration came with distance. Those who praised her also feared her. They kept their visits short. They took what she offered, but never touched her threshold. In villages shaped by pattern, by rhythm, by inherited ways, every season was a chance to show that one belonged. A woman who moved outside these rhythms, who stepped sideways while others moved forward, did not need to speak to be seen. And the more seasons she passed in this way, the more stories collected around her name. In old Romanian life, sickness was a part of every household. It visited without warning. It stayed too long. It left traces behind. Without doctors, without medicine, as we know it today, people relied on herbs, blessings, and patience. But when illness did not pass, or when it returned again and again, People began to look for causes beyond the body. Sometimes the cause was the air. Sometimes it was a curse. Sometimes, they said, it was the doing of a woman. A woman who became ill herself was often pitied at first. If she grew pale, people said she needed strong soup and warm hands. If she fainted or weakened, they prayed for her. But if she did not recover, if the illness stayed, if she became thinner each season and her eyes grew distant, pity turned into unease. Sick women who did not speak were feared, especially those who looked past people instead of at them, who sat still for hours, unmoving, who no longer joined the others in daily tasks, who hummed when no one else was singing, who answered questions with silence. These were signs of something deeper. Some illnesses brought confusion or changed behavior. A woman who began to talk to herself or to someone others could not see was whispered about. If she laughed during funerals or wept during weddings, people said her mind had gone. But they also said it had gone somewhere else, since to another world. And perhaps something from that world had taken her place. Mental suffering was not understood. There were no words for depression, anxiety, or trauma. There were only observations. She does not eat. She walks at night. She stares at the fire too long. If she whispered to her food before eating or washed her hands again and again, people said she was not right. Sometimes, after losing a child or a husband, a woman withdrew. She wore black longer than expected. She refused to greet neighbors. She burned clothing instead of giving it away. These acts, born from grief, were not always accepted. People began to say she was holding on to death. That morning had turned into something darker. Women who recovered but changed were watched closely. If they survived a fever but woke with different eyes, if they had no memory of certain days, if their voice returned slower or sharper or too quiet, people said the sickness had opened a door, that perhaps something else had come in when the fever went out. There were old beliefs about illness being tied to spirits, that a woman could become a vessel willing or not for something that moved between worlds. If she shivered without cold or spoke in words no one taught her or drew symbols in the dust, these signs were remembered, not recorded, not spoken aloud in gatherings, but passed quietly from ear to ear. Some women hid their illnesses. They did not want to be seen as weak, but their efforts often had the opposite effect. If a woman covered her face too often, people wondered what she was hiding. If she refused visitors, they said she had something to conceal. If her house smelled of unfamiliar herbs, or if the curtains never opened, they said she was treating something unspeakable. There were also cases where others became ill after visiting her. A cousin who lost her voice, a baby who cried for days, a dog who would not eat. These coincidences were tied back to her. If she had touched them, spoken to them, or even looked at them, it was enough, even if she had done so kindly. Sometimes illness made the body look unusual. Swollen joints, trembling hands, one eye that drifted, or a mouth that tilted without control. These physical signs, when left unexplained, became symbols of danger. People said her body had changed because of what lived inside her, that she had been marked by something no one could see. There were also women who helped others during sickness. They brought soup, washed linen, sat by the bed. But if the person died, their kindness became suspicious. She was the last one to speak to him, they would say. She touched his feet before he passed, or she walked home too calmly. Her helpfulness became part of the story. In some cases, illness was believed to be passed by glance or breath. If a woman was thought to carry such sickness, she was avoided. People did not eat her food. They did not let their children near her. They did not touch her belongings. And if they had to speak to her, they did so from a distance, with arms folded and shoulders turned slightly away. Some illnesses caused strange sleep. A woman might sleep too much or too little. She might be heard talking in her dreams, or seen walking in her sleep. Sleepwalking was deeply feared. It was said the soul had left the body, wandering while the body remained behind. If she walked through the house at night with her eyes open, people said she was not fully human. A woman who recovered from a long illness but never smiled again was not considered well. People said her spirit had not come back fully, that a part of her still lived where the illness had taken her, and because she had one foot in that other world, she could touch others with it too. These ideas were not written laws. They were not part of the church, but they lived in the minds of villagers. They shaped how people were treated, and women, more than men, were measured against these quiet fears. In a world where health was fragile and explanation was rare, the woman whose body betrayed her and whose soul seemed different afterward was often left alone. And in that silence, the word, which grew slowly, like mold in corners, never reached by sunlight. In the villages of old Romania, life was filled with small objects. Some were made by hand. Others were passed down. A handful of dried herbs, a piece of red string, a carved spoon, a bit of bone, a linen cloth folded a certain way. These things seemed ordinary, but they carried meaning. People did not speak of magic openly, but they believed in protection, and they believed that danger could be kept away by prayer, but by careful acts. A mother tied red thread around her baby's wrist. A farmer hung garlic on his stable door. A woman placed a bit of salt in her apron pocket before walking to the market. These were not strange customs. They were daily acts, quiet shields against misfortune. But if a woman used too many charms, or if her charms looked different, people noticed. Most villagers knew the common signs: a cross drawn on bread before baking, a braid of wheat on the wall, a coin placed under the bed during illness. These gestures were accepted, even expected. But if a woman used patterns others didn't know, or muttered words not tied to the church, her actions were questioned. If she kept dolls made of corn husks and no children played with them, people asked why. If she burned herbs no one recognized, they said she was summoning. If she painted symbols on her door in ashes or clay, people wondered what she was keeping outward, calling in. Symbols held quiet power. A star with too many points, a circle with a line through it, a set of 3 dots. These were found in old books, on cloths, scratched into wooden beams. Most people didn't know their meaning, but they remembered which woman had made them. Handmade objects were especially watched. A pouch sewn from black fabric, a bottle filled with dried flowers, a candle with something pressed inside. These items might be innocent, or they might not. People didn't ask. They assumed. If she gave a neighbor a gift, a scarf, a cake, a ribbon, and the neighbor later became sick or unlucky, the object became cursed. People said she had placed something inside it, not something visible, something spoken, something hidden. The same was said of water. If she offered water from her own bucket and it tasted strange, people poured it out. If her well looked darker than others, if frogs gathered near it, if moss grew too thick on the edge, they said the water itself had changed. Some women wrote things down, not letters, but symbols, words in strange order, lists with no names. These writings were often found on scraps of cloth or slips of bark. A woman might carry one tucked into her sleeve or hung around her neck in a bag. If someone found it, they read it like a spell leaven, if it was only a memory or a recipe or a name. A woman who carved shapes into soap or folded paper into corners, or knotted her hair in 3 strands instead of 2. These were not large acts, but they were enough. They broke from the usual. They made people pause. Even useful things could raise suspicion. If she sewed too quickly, they said her needle was guided. If her bread rose better than others, they said she fed it with something other than yeast. If her chickens laid more eggs, her soil grew thicker crops, or her cow never fell ill. They asked what she was hiding. And if she gave advice on luck, on the future, it had to be cautious. A wrong word remembered could become a reason. If she said, "Be careful," and something bad happened, they said she knew. If she said, "You will see," and a child became sick, they said she caused it. There were stories of women who wore belts made of hair, who buried stones under trees, who drew eyes on clay pots. These were half true, half remembered. A neighbor might say, "She does strange things with her hands." Another might say, "She never looks at what she touches." These observations were repeated. They were not accusations, but they were enough. Some symbols were misunderstood. The sign of protection looked like a mark of danger. A line to block illness was seen as an invitation to harm. If a woman decorated her home differently, more red, more black, more circles, people did not ask what it meant. They simply looked away. Women sometimes used charms to help others, to ease pain, to bring calm. But if the charm failed, the help turned into harm. A tea that brought no sleep, a cloth that brought no healing, a word that brought no peace. These failures were remembered more than any success. Even the way she touched objects mattered. If she stirred soup counterclockwise, if she swept dust into a corner instead of the door, these were small signs, but they were collected, not by one person, but by many. And slowly they built a picture. A woman who owned too many unusual things, bones, feathers, beads, black buttons, was said to be keeping tools. If she hid them, it proved it. If she did not, it proved it too. People feared what they could not name. They feared things too old, too quiet, too carefully made. And when they could not explain misfortune, they searched for signs. A charm in the wrong place, a cloth too well folded, a word spoken twice. The woman who knew symbols and who used them without sharing stood apart, not because she was evil, but because her world was more detailed than theirs. And in the gaps between what was understood and what was feared, the old word was waiting, which